The coordinates on the 1887 geological survey didn't match anything Dakota Martinez could see through her truck windshield. According to the faded ink markings, a major fault line should run directly beneath the cracked asphalt where she'd parked. Yet every modern survey showed solid bedrock for miles. The old measuring tools drawn in the margins suggested measurements that defied current reality. She traced her finger along the elevation markings that spiraled downward into what the map labeled as underground chamber, a formation that supposedly didn't exist according to every report filed in Brewster County since 1960. The most disturbing detail wasn't what the map showed, but what it predicted. Beneath her inherited land lay something that had been deliberately erased from public records. 3 weeks had passed since Dakota inherited the seemingly worthless 640 acres from her grandfather's estate, and every real estate appraiser who'd visited had delivered the same brutal assessment. The property held no commercial value whatsoever. The oil speculation boom had bypassed this particular stretch of West Texas, leaving behind only dried creek beds and chalky soil that wouldn't support cattle ranching. Every neighbor she'd spoken with had offered their condolences on receiving such a financial burden, while the smooth-talking land speculator who'd been calling daily insisted she'd be wise to accept his lowball offer before property taxes consumed whatever inheritance money she had left. Dakota spread the collection of survey maps across her truck's tailgate, each one telling a different story about the same 640 acres. The 1960s county assessments showed barren rangeland, suitable only for minimal grazing. The 1970s environmental studies indicated depleted groundwater and unstable soil composition. Yet the pre-1900 territorial surveys painted an entirely different picture, one that included detailed annotations about underground chambers, unusual mineral deposits, and geological formations that had somehow vanished from all subsequent documentation. She pulled out her grandfather's field notes, written in his distinctive engineer's handwriting, filled with calculations that referenced these vanished formations. His final entry, dated just 2 months before his death, contained a single cryptic line that made her stomach tighten with possibility. The Bergstrom acquisition attempts confirm our family's geological assessments were accurate. They know exactly what lies beneath Sector 7. The afternoon wind picked up, scattering loose papers across the desert scrub. But Dakota barely noticed as she stared at the name she'd heard repeatedly over the past 3 weeks. Clayton Bergstrom, the same land speculator who'd been pressuring her to sell, the same man who'd somehow obtained detailed surveys of her property before she'd even inherited it. Her phone buzzed with another call from an unknown number, but this time Dakota didn't ignore it. Something told her the conversation she was about to have would change everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. The voice on the other end belonged to Elena Santos, a woman Dakota had never heard of, but who claimed to have worked alongside her grandfather for 30 years as a cartographer for the state land office. Elena's words came fast and urgent, tinged with an anxiety that made Dakota's pulse quicken. She explained that she'd been trying to reach Dakota ever since learning about the inheritance, but had been afraid to call until now. Someone had been asking questions about the old surveys, and Elena feared that Dakota might be walking into a situation far more dangerous than she realized. Elena insisted they meet immediately at the county records office before it closed, claiming she had documents that would explain everything about the discrepancies Dakota had discovered. During the 40-minute drive into town, Dakota's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them prepared her for what Elena revealed when they finally sat across from each other in the dusty archives room. The elderly woman spread out a series of photocopied surveys from the 1950s, each one bearing official seals and signatures that Dakota recognized from her geology background. According to Elena's documents, a joint geological survey conducted by the State Land Office and Shell Oil Company in 1954 had identified a massive salt dome formation beneath what was now Dakota's property. The technical specifications were precise and detailed, a dome structure approximately 2 miles in diameter, extending down nearly 8,000 feet, with characteristic geological markers that typically indicated significant hydrocarbon deposits trapped beneath the impermeable salt cap. The survey team had recommended immediate exploratory drilling, projecting potential reserves in the hundreds of millions of barrels based on similar formations discovered throughout the Texas Gulf Coast. Elena pointed to a specific section of the report that made Dakota's hands shake as she read it. The mineral rights assessment clearly stated that the subsurface formations extended well beyond the boundaries of the surrounding properties, meaning that whoever controlled the central acreage would effectively control access to the entire oil field. The report concluded with a recommendation that the state land office acquire the property through eminent domain to prevent private monopolization of such a significant natural resource. However, Elena explained, the report had never been filed with the county clerk's office. Instead, all copies had been mysteriously classified as confidential and sealed away in state archives that required special clearance to access. The official geological surveys filed with Brewster County showed no such formations, no recommendations for drilling, and no mention of potential hydrocarbon deposits. Someone had deliberately buried the real survey while ensuring that fraudulent reports became part of the permanent public record. Dakota studied the signatures on Elena's photocopies and felt her stomach drop as she recognized one of the names at the bottom of the document. The lead surveyor who had signed off on the original Salt Dome assessment was listed as Clayton Bergstrom Sr., father of the same man who had been pressuring her to sell her inheritance for a fraction of its true value. Elena leaned forward and whispered something that chilled Dakota to her core. The Bergstrom family had been sitting on this information for nearly 70 years, waiting for the right moment to acquire the property legally and begin extraction operations. Dakota's grandfather had somehow obtained copies of the real surveys, and his refusal to sell had been the only thing standing between the Bergstroms and one of the largest undiscovered oil reserves in West Texas. Dakota stared at the photocopied signatures until her eyes burned, trying to process the magnitude of what Elena had just revealed. The implications were staggering. Not only was her inherited land potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but an entire family had spent decades orchestrating an elaborate deception to steal it from her grandfather. Elena gathered the documents quickly and explained that they needed to leave the records office immediately, as she'd noticed the same black SUV parked outside that had been following her for the past 2 days. As they walked toward the parking lot, Elena handed Dakota a sealed manila envelope and instructed her to guard it with her life. Inside were copies of additional geological reports, mineral rights assessments, and most importantly, a detailed legal analysis prepared by her grandfather shortly before his death. According to Elena, the old man had suspected that his time was running out and had been methodically gathering evidence to ensure that Dakota would inherit not just the land, but the knowledge necessary to protect it from the Bergstrom family's schemes. Dakota drove home with her mind spinning, Elena's warnings echoing in her ears. The older woman had made it clear that Clayton Bergstrom would not hesitate to use legal intimidation, property tax manipulation, or even more direct threats to force a sale before Dakota could discover the truth about her inheritance. The fact that Bergstrom had been calling her daily with increasingly generous offers suddenly made perfect sense. He was growing desperate to close the deal before she had time to investigate the property's actual value. Back at her grandfather's ranch house, Dakota spread Elena's documents across the kitchen table and began cross-referencing them with her grandfather's field notes. The technical specifications matched perfectly, confirming that the Salt Dome formation was real and that the potential oil reserves were even larger than she'd initially imagined. Her grandfather's legal analysis revealed something even more crucial. Because the mineral rights had never been properly separated from the surface rights, Dakota owned complete control over any subsurface resources discovered on her property. However, her grandfather's notes also contained a sobering warning about the challenges she would face. Proving ownership of the mineral rights would require expensive legal representation, and actually extracting the oil would require millions of dollars in capital investment that she didn't possess. The Bergstrom family had both the financial resources and the political connections to tie her up in court for years, while continuing to pressure her through various legal and economic channels. Dakota's cell phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed Clayton Bergstrom's name. She let it go to voicemail, then played back his message with growing unease. His tone had shifted from the friendly persistence of previous calls to something much more pointed and threatening. He mentioned having spoken with several local contractors about potential development projects on her property and suggested that she might find it difficult to obtain permits for any improvements or modifications to the land without his assistance. The message ended with Bergstrom informing her that he would be stopping by her property the following morning to make what he called his final offer. He strongly advised her to be prepared to accept his terms, as he'd recently learned that the county tax assessor would be conducting a complete reevaluation of her property's value. which could result in tax obligations that would force an immediate sale regardless of her personal preferences. Dakota hung up the phone and realized that her grandfather's fight had now become her own. Tomorrow morning, she would face the man who had spent decades trying to steal her family's inheritance. Clayton Bergstrom arrived precisely at 8 in the morning, driving the same black SUV that Elena had warned Dakota about. He stepped out wearing an expensive suit that seemed completely out of place in the desert heat, accompanied by 2 other men who remained by the vehicle while he approached Dakota's front porch. His confident smile and firm handshake couldn't mask the calculation in his eyes as he surveyed the property, with the familiarity of someone who had been planning this moment for decades. Bergstrom wasted no time with pleasantries, immediately launching into what he presented as his final and most generous offer. He quoted a figure that was triple his previous proposals, enough to cover Dakota's student loans and provide a comfortable nest egg, but still a fraction of what she now knew the property was actually worth. He explained that his company was prepared to handle all legal paperwork and closing costs and could have cash in her account within 48 hours if she signed the purchase agreement he'd brought with him. Dakota listened carefully as Bergstrom outlined the supposed benefits of accepting his offer, noting how he repeatedly emphasized the financial burdens of property ownership in such a remote area. He mentioned rising property taxes, the cost of maintaining ranch infrastructure, and the challenges of generating income from land that appeared unsuitable for agriculture or livestock. His tone remained friendly, but contained an underlying edge that made it clear this conversation was not entirely optional. When Dakota politely declined his offer and mentioned that she planned to keep the property in the family, Bergstrom's demeanor shifted noticeably. He asked pointed questions about her financial situation, her employment prospects, and her ability to handle the ongoing expenses associated with land ownership. He seemed particularly interested in whether she had consulted with any lawyers or geological experts about the property's potential value, questions that confirmed Dakota's suspicions about his true motives. Bergstrom then revealed information that he should not have possessed, including details about her grandfather's final medical expenses, the outstanding balance on the property taxes, and even her current credit card debt. He suggested that someone with her educational background should understand the mathematical reality of her situation, implying that stubbornness would only lead to financial ruin when the inevitable property tax increases forced a sale anyway. The conversation took a more ominous turn when Bergstrom mentioned that his associates had recently spoken with several local contractors and suppliers, all of whom had been advised that any work performed on Dakota's property would likely face significant permit delays and inspection challenges. He explained that building codes in Brewster County had become much more stringent recently, particularly for properties with questionable environmental compliance histories. Dakota felt her anger rising as she realized the extent of Bergstrom's preparation for this confrontation. He had clearly spent considerable time and resources mapping out every possible pressure point he could use to force her cooperation. However, his overconfidence had also revealed something crucial about his strategy. He was operating under the assumption that she remained ignorant about the property's true value, which meant he didn't yet know about Elena Santos or the documents she had provided. Bergstrom concluded his visit by placing the purchase agreement on her porch table and informing her that the offer would expire at midnight. As he walked back toward his vehicle, he turned and delivered what sounded very much like a threat disguised as friendly advice about the dangers of isolated rural living for a woman alone. Dakota watched Bergstrom's SUV disappear down the dirt road before allowing herself to process the full impact of their confrontation. His casual mention of her personal financial details and his threats about permit delays confirmed that he possessed resources and connections she hadn't fully appreciated. However, his assumption that she would cave under pressure also revealed a critical weakness in his strategy. He was still operating as if she knew nothing about the oil deposits beneath her property. She immediately called Elena Santos and recounted every detail of Bergstrom's visit, paying particular attention to his comments about property tax reevaluations and building permit complications. Elena listened with growing concern, then explained that Bergstrom's tactics followed a pattern she'd observed during her years working for the state land office. Unscrupulous speculators would often coordinate with county officials to create artificial financial pressure on property owners, forcing them to sell valuable land at below-market prices. Elena suggested that Dakota needed legal representation immediately, but warned that finding an attorney willing to challenge someone with Bergstrom's political connections would require careful selection. She recommended a lawyer named Marcus Webb, who specialized in mineral rights disputes, and had successfully fought similar cases against well-connected opponents. However, Elena emphasized that Dakota would need to move quickly. As Bergstrom's midnight deadline suggested, he was working to close the deal before she could mount an effective defense. After hanging up with Elena, Dakota drove to her grandfather's old workshop and began searching through boxes of documents he'd stored there over the years. In a filing cabinet hidden beneath stacks of engineering manuals, she discovered additional surveying equipment and field notes that painted an even clearer picture of the oil formation beneath her property. Her grandfather had apparently spent years conducting unofficial geological surveys using his own equipment, building an extensive database of core samples and measurements that supported the conclusions in Elena's documents. One particular folder contained correspondence between her grandfather and several major oil companies from the 1980s and 1990s, all expressing interest in leasing drilling rights for the property. Each company had offered substantial upfront payments and generous royalty percentages, but all the letters ended abruptly with no record of any deals being finalized. Dakota found a handwritten note from her grandfather, explaining that he'd decided against leasing to any of the major companies after learning about Bergstrom's ongoing efforts to acquire the land through legal manipulation. The most significant discovery came in the form of a safety deposit box key taped to the bottom of one of the file drawers, along with instructions for accessing a box at First National Bank in the neighboring county. Her grandfather's note indicated that the box contained the original geological surveys, mineral rights documentation, and legal analysis that would prove Dakota's ownership of the subsurface resources beyond any possible challenge. However, as Dakota prepared to drive to the bank, she noticed the same black SUV parked at the end of her driveway. Bergstrom's associates had apparently remained in the area to monitor her activities, which meant that any move she made toward securing legal help or gathering additional evidence would be immediately reported back to their employer. She realized that getting to the safety deposit box without alerting Bergstrom to her knowledge of its contents would require more careful planning than she'd initially anticipated. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Dakota considered her options, knowing that every hour of delay brought her closer to Bergstrom's midnight deadline and whatever consequences he had planned if she refused his offer. Dakota waited until sunset before making her move, using the cover of dusk to slip out through the back of her property and circle around to the main road without alerting Bergstrom's surveillance team. The drive to First National Bank took 45 minutes through winding rural roads, but she arrived just as the bank manager was locking up for the evening. After explaining her situation and showing proper identification, the manager reluctantly agreed to allow her access to the safety deposit box her grandfather had maintained for over 20 years. The box contained exactly what Elena had promised, but also something Dakota hadn't expected. Beneath the official geological surveys and mineral rights documentation lay a handwritten letter addressed specifically to her, dated just 1 week before her grandfather's death. His familiar engineering script filled 3 pages with words that brought tears to her eyes as she read them in the privacy of the bank's viewing room. He wrote about watching her grow up with the same stubborn determination that had kept him fighting the Bergstrom family for decades. He explained how proud he felt, knowing that his granddaughter had become a geologist, someone who would understand the true significance of what lay beneath their family land. The letter detailed his decades-long battle to protect the property from speculators who viewed it only as a commodity to be exploited, and his hope that Dakota would have the strength to finish what he'd started. But the most powerful part of the letter described his real motivation for keeping the oil rights within the family. He'd witnessed too many rural communities destroyed by extraction companies that took the wealth from the land while leaving behind environmental damage and economic instability. His vision was for Dakota to eventually lease drilling rights to a company that would share profits with the local community, creating sustainable prosperity rather than short-term exploitation. The letter concluded with specific instructions for contacting Marcus Webb, the mineral rights attorney Elena had recommended, along with a substantial check made out to Dakota that would cover legal expenses and provide financial security during the upcoming fight. Her grandfather had liquidated his retirement savings to ensure she would have the resources necessary to defend their family legacy. Armed with the original documents and her grandfather's blessing, Dakota drove back toward her property with renewed determination. However, as she turned onto her access road, she discovered that Bergstrom hadn't waited until midnight to escalate his tactics. 3 vehicles were parked in her driveway, including a Brewster County Sheriff's patrol car with emergency lights flashing in the darkness. Clayton Bergstrom stood on her front porch holding what appeared to be an official document, flanked by a county deputy and another man in an expensive suit who was taking photographs of the property. The scene looked like a carefully orchestrated legal seizure, and Dakota realized that Bergstrom had decided to force the issue rather than wait for her response to his ultimatum. She parked behind the sheriff's vehicle and walked toward the confrontation that would determine whether she could hold on to her inheritance or lose everything her grandfather had spent his life protecting. The deputy sheriff looked uncomfortable as Dakota approached, clearly uncertain about his role in what was obviously a civil dispute rather than a criminal matter. Bergstrom immediately launched into an explanation that Dakota had missed the deadline for responding to his offer, and that he was now serving her with notice of a tax lien enforcement action that would require immediate payment or property forfeiture. The document in his hand bore official county seals, but Dakota noticed that it had been filed less than 4 hours earlier, an impossibly fast turnaround that suggested extensive advance preparation. Dakota calmly pulled out her cell phone and called Marcus Webb, the attorney her grandfather had recommended, even at 9 in the evening. Webb answered immediately and listened as Dakota explained the situation and read the key details from the tax lien document. After a brief pause, Webb informed everyone present that he was officially representing Dakota Martinez in all matters related to the property, and that any further legal actions would need to be coordinated through his office. Webb's involvement changed the dynamic immediately. The deputy sheriff requested copies of all legal documents and informed Bergstrom that he could not assist with property seizure until proper court proceedings had been completed. The man taking photographs was identified as a county tax assessor who admitted he'd been asked to provide an emergency appraisal at Bergstrom's request, but had no legal authority to support any immediate enforcement actions. Sensing that his carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart, Bergstrom made a critical mistake. In his frustration, he revealed specific details about the oil formation beneath Dakota's property, information he could only have obtained through his family's decades-old geological surveys. He argued that the county had a responsibility to ensure proper development of such valuable natural resources, and that Dakota lacked the expertise and financial capacity to manage extraction operations responsibly. Dakota seized the moment to reveal her own geological background and her complete knowledge of the salt dome formation that Bergstrom had been trying to hide. She explained to the deputy sheriff that she possessed documentation proving that the Bergstrom family had been manipulating public records and tax assessments for decades to artificially suppress the property's apparent value while planning to acquire it through fraudulent means. The deputy sheriff requested that all parties accompany him to the county courthouse the following morning, where a judge could review the competing legal claims and determine the legitimacy of the tax lien enforcement action. He made it clear that no property seizure would occur until proper legal procedures had been followed, effectively blocking Bergstrom's attempt to force an immediate resolution. As the sheriff's vehicle pulled away, Bergstrom approached Dakota with barely controlled anger. He informed her that she had made a serious mistake by involving attorneys and law enforcement in what could have been a simple business transaction. He warned that fighting him would result in years of expensive legal battles that would ultimately bankrupt her, regardless of the property's actual value. Dakota stood her ground and delivered a response that her grandfather would have been proud of, informing Bergstrom that some things were more important than money, and that she intended to honor her family's legacy, regardless of the cost. The courthouse hearing the next morning lasted 3 hours and ended with Judge Patricia Coleman delivering a decision that vindicated everything Dakota's grandfather had fought to protect. Marcus Webb's presentation of the original geological surveys, along with Elena Santos's testimony about the deliberate falsification of public records, resulted in immediate dismissal of the tax lien enforcement action. Judge Coleman also ordered a full investigation into the county tax assessor's improper collaboration with private interests, leading to criminal charges that would eventually send Clayton Bergstrom to federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. The revelation of the oil dome's existence triggered a bidding war among major energy companies that transformed Dakota's financial situation overnight. Rather than accepting the highest offer, she honored her grandfather's vision by negotiating a partnership with Chevron that included substantial community profit sharing and environmental protection guarantees. The initial lease payment alone exceeded $20 million, with ongoing royalties projected to generate hundreds of millions more over the lifetime of the extraction operation. Dakota used her newfound resources to establish the Martinez Community Development Fund, which provided scholarships, healthcare services, and infrastructure improvements throughout Brewster County. The fund also purchased additional land to create a nature preserve that would protect the region's ecosystem while allowing sustainable economic development. Elena Santos became the fund's first director, using her expertise to ensure that mineral extraction proceeded with maximum environmental responsibility. Clayton Bergstrom's criminal conviction exposed a network of corruption that had affected dozens of similar cases throughout West Texas. The federal investigation revealed that his family had been systematically manipulating property records and tax assessments for over 40 years, stealing millions of dollars worth of natural resources from unsuspecting landowners. Recovery actions initiated by the FBI resulted in compensation for numerous families who had been defrauded by the Bergstrom conspiracy. Dakota kept her grandfather's ranch house as her primary residence, but transformed the surrounding property into a model of sustainable development that balanced resource extraction with environmental conservation. She hired local workers for all phases of the operation, creating jobs that revitalized the rural economy while maintaining the area's cultural heritage. The success of her approach attracted national attention and established new standards for responsible mineral development in the American West. 6 months after the courthouse confrontation, Dakota stood in the same spot where she had first discovered the discrepancies in her grandfather's maps. The drilling operations were proceeding exactly as planned, generating wealth that would benefit the community for generations while preserving the land's natural beauty. She had transformed from a woman who thought she'd been scammed into a powerful advocate for rural communities and environmental justice. The old maps that had started her journey now hung framed in her living room, alongside a photograph of her grandfather and the letter he'd written expressing his confidence in her strength and determination. She had not only protected her family's legacy, but had created something even more valuable, a model for how communities could control their own destiny while sharing prosperity with everyone who called the land home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and determination collide with unexpected discoveries in ways you never imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.